What is a bird? Now, you've seen a bunch of these in previous talks. These are phylogenetic trees or phylogenies. So these are proposed evolutionary histories. Two different ones depicting sort of the same thing, different levels of detail. So here's our organism of interest down here. And if you look, I think it's probably easier to see over here. There are birds. Last time we talked about mammals. So birds and mammals are pretty closely related. And then right next to birds are all these things. What kinds of animals are these? Those are all reptiles. Now, in phylogenetics, the study of the evolution of the species, anytime you have a group of organisms all descended from a single common ancestor, all those things are called a clade, and they should all be in the same clade. So birds are not birds, birds are reptiles. This is the reptile clade. Birds are in that. Here's the common ancestor. But if you tell college faculty, well, you can't teach ornithology anymore, that's never going to happen. So we keep this group as an identified group only essentially for tradition and to make people like me happy. Okay, so one answer to what are birds, what is a bird, is that a bird is a reptile. And where do birds come from? Oops. So one way to answer what is a bird is to say, well, what are its characteristics? What do you look for? So there are several characteristics. Now, Dana mentioned some of them last time when she talked about reptiles. We know that birds are what we call endothermic or warm-blooded, which means they use their metabolism to generate and control heat, their body temperature. We also know, if you remember from Tuesday, they're vertebrates, so they have a backbone. They're actually chordates, so it's a larger group. But getting closer to what we might be interested in, they lay eggs. They have feathers. We'll talk more about feathers in a bit. Most, but not all, can fly. Right? So we'll talk about adaptations for flight as well. That's pretty interesting. So what about, yeah?
So the comment, reptiles are cold-blooded, doesn't fit anymore.
Correct. And some of the, quote, reptiles that we think about, dinosaurs, were probably not cold-blooded. So we think endothermy evolved in dinosaurs somewhere. So birds, we know from fossil evidence, evolved from theropod dinosaurs. So another way to describe birds is, well, they're living dinosaurs. So when the kids come to the park and you ask them, what do you expect to see? You're going to get answers like lions, giraffes, elephants, dinosaurs. Well, you're not going to see any of the first ones, but you will see dinosaurs, sort of. So this is a very famous fossil. This is an Archaeopteryx from the lithographic limestone. I think it's Bavaria. And there are replicas of this. There was a replica that hung in the zoology laboratory at my college. They have this, when birds die, reptiles too, they always do this strange bend of the head, backward bend of the head that has something to do with the ligaments when they die. And here's an artist's rendering of what that we think looked like. So if you look at this Archaeopteryx, it's sort of half reptile, half bird. Right? It's got some characteristics that we would normally call bird-like. It's definitely got feathers. We are pretty sure from the structure of the feathers that this animal could fly. But it also has a long bony tail with feathers attached to each of the segments. That's very unbird-like. And it's got a jaw with teeth. Birds don't have teeth. So this is sort of halfway between a bird and a reptile. It also has these claws. So obviously the wing is the forelimb. This is the hand. And there are two of the other fingers. So this right here is the wrist of the wing. That's the part that bends. Yeah. Right, so yes, flight is kind of characteristic of birds, although we acknowledge that not all birds can fly. Some of the largest birds that exist today are so-called flightless birds. They're also pretty dangerous. They could kill you with a single kick. But the typical birds that we think of exhibit a number of adaptations for flight, things, characteristics that enable them to fly. So if you think about it, what does a bird have to be able to do to fly? Well, one thing is it needs to be light. Can't be really heavy. So one way to, and I'll talk about other ways too, one way to reduce weight is to take your bones and hollow them out. So bird bones are hollow, but if you just make them a hollow bone, it's not very strong. So you also need to retain strength. And so what they do, this is a good engineering solution, is to put these little struts inside the bone so that retains the light weight, but also makes them very strong. And by the way, all these slides are available on the website. So that's one adaptation for flight. Another is that birds have an amazing respiratory system, much more efficient than, say, mammalian respiratory systems like ours. So when we take a breath, air goes into the lungs, and then when we exhale, air comes out the same way and goes back out. And it's actually very hard to ventilate all of the air that was in there, right? There's some always residual air that's left in the lung. Even if you try to breathe in deeply and breathe out as much as you can, birds do not have that problem because instead of an in-out the same way system, they have a flow-through system. So air enters one end and exits the other end, and the flow through is continuous. So one way they accomplish that, so they have lungs like we do, but they also have these things called air sacs. Some of the air sacs even extend into the hollow parts of bones. And so the inspiration cycle for birds is actually inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. That's one full cycle. So in the first inhale, air is pulled into the lung sacs before the lung. In the first exhale, the air from those lung sacs go through the lungs. In the next inhale, the air that was in the lungs goes into the anterior air sacs. And then in the second exhale, that air is expelled, which means that as the bird is breathing, air is continuously flowing over the exchange surfaces of the lungs, which makes them very efficient. This is why birds can fly at very high altitudes. They can fly fast, and they can fly far. We'll talk about that in a bit too. Some other adaptations that you might not think about, they have fused vertebrae. So some of the backbones are actually fused together for strength. And if you think about it, it has to be able to flap, generate lift. But if the backbone is weak or flopping around, that's not very efficient. So having a stiff backbone really helps. Also, in females during the breeding season, only one ovary produces eggs. So during development, they are hatched with two gonads, potential gonads. Only one develops into a functional ovary producing eggs, and it gets really big in the breeding season and then regresses in the non-breeding season, becomes small. So it only carries that weight when it needs to during the breeding season, and only one of them develops. So that's another weight-saving adaptation. They can also change their internal physiology and anatomy completely from one season to the next. So during the breeding season, they probably need to feed insects and eat insects, feed insects to their young, eat insects themselves, but during the non-breeding season, they probably switch to seeds. So they can change their digestive systems to accommodate the different foods they're eating. So that's pretty amazing to me. But these are adaptations for flight, but how did flight itself evolve? Well, we think it probably evolved in dinosaurs, some of them. But there are actually three competing hypotheses, proposed explanations, for how that happened. So some of these are more accepted than others. I won't get into the details. So this is an artist's rendering of a skeleton of an Archaeopteryx standing on a branch. And what the ancestors of flying reptiles did was they're a little bit like flying squirrels. They had a membranous wing, and they would jump off the branch and glide down to the ground. Okay, so there's an advantage to that. But of course, if you can go a little farther, that's better. And how do you go a little farther? Well, if you can flap somehow, generate a little bit of lift, you can glide farther. And you can see over time, selection will favor better and better ability to go farther and farther. And eventually that turned into flight. So this is called the trees down hypothesis, or the arboreal hypothesis. Okay, the second idea is here. It's the ground up or cursorial hypothesis. So according to this, birds started by running along the ground like dinosaurs. Think back to Jurassic Park when they're running through the field, the dinosaurs. And then, well, maybe they're flapping to go a little faster. And then that flapping developed into flight. So that's the ground up. Now this one is the most recent. It's not very old, maybe 25 years or so. This is the incline running hypothesis, and this was actually tested with quail. So here's a bird walking, and then here's a bird walking up an incline. So you know from your own experience that if you're hiking, there's only a certain degree of incline that you can handle, and at some point you just can't walk up it anymore, right? Well, if a bird flaps, it can create downforce by flapping, and that enables it to go up a steeper incline, like that. Actually, I'm told that, if you follow racing, these really fancy, like Indianapolis race cars or Formula One cars, they always have that wing on the back, the spoiler. That's to create downforce. It's to push the back wheels down against the pavement. And supposedly, if those things get up to speed, they could actually go straight up the side of a building. And they could maybe even go up a slight angle, even more than 90 degrees. So it's the same idea. So once you're generating downforce, it's like that. It's not that hard to imagine flipping the bird this way, and now that downforce becomes thrust and lift. So 3 different ideas for how flight evolved. Now, flight itself, it's something that catches our eye. It's one of the things that probably first attracted people to birds. And it enables some amazing behavior, including long-distance migration. Now, of course, birds are not the only animals that can migrate. So we know that some insects migrate, monarch butterflies, for example, although it takes them 4 generations to do that. Reptiles can migrate, turtles. Fish can migrate, salmon. Marine mammals can migrate, whales. Terrestrial mammals can migrate, so wildebeest, things like that. But birds have an amazing ability to migrate, some of them over very long distances. So the Arctic tern, for example, goes essentially from Arctic Circle to Antarctic Circle and back every year. That's a long flight. And they do that non-stop, day and night. So here are some of the distance records. I know that it's not very clear, but that's what happens when you try to download things from the internet. Now, this has been studied in a number of different ways. One really interesting way is with homing pigeons. So homing pigeons are trained, they have to be trained to return to a home loft, right? So when I was in college, I took animal behavior. The person who taught that course studied homing pigeon homing. And he did that. He was a Cabot. Anybody here from Massachusetts? So the Cabots talked to the lodges, and the lodges talked to God. So he was from a very wealthy family, which meant he owned his own twin-engine plane. So he would put radio transmitters on the back of a homing pigeon, have his research team drive them to a place they'd never been before, release them while he's orbiting, flying around, and then he would just follow them back in his plane. Pretty amazing. Now, he was doing this in the Boston area, so planes have to, obey FAA rules and things. They're not supposed to fly through Logan Airport space. Pigeons don't seem to know that. So he'd be following a pigeon, and he'd be coming close to Logan Airport, so he'd have to radio in and say, ask for permission to fly through, and they would always want to know why. So he'd say, well, I'm following a pigeon. So you can imagine what the first reaction was. But after a few times, they actually got to know him. So they would just radio back, pigeon chaser cleared through Logan airspace. Now, some of these homing pigeons are really accurate, so they can come, even if they've never been to the place where they've been being released, they can get right back, almost on a direct line. And his flight showed the route that they took. So it looked like, from his observational information, that what they do is they use some kind of a navigation system, compass and map system, to get within the general area of the loft. And then once they get close, they use landmarks to get back to the loft. Except for one particular bird, it always goes to this one woman's lawn near the home loft at Cornell. And he would just land there and kind of walk around until the woman came out and picked him up, put him in her car, and drive him to the loft. So that was very efficient. So other methods, yeah.
So with the Earth always rotating and the poles always moving,
Yep.
how do birds know? Like, it's changing all the time, so then how do they know where they're really going?
Really good question. Not only that, but every 10,000 years or so, the poles reverse. The magnetic poles reverse. So the North Pole becomes in the south and vice versa. So they have to have ways of, they have to have mechanisms for figuring out the compass direction and where they are relative to home. In other words, a map. So those have been investigated by ornithologists in a number of different ways. One of them I just described, just to follow them. Another way is to, some birds migrate, they do their long distance migration at night. So it was hypothesized they're using the stars somehow. But it's hard to manipulate the sky. So if you wanted to know what they're doing, it would be really nice if you could put them somewhere where you could control what the sky looks like. Any guesses?
Oh, no. I had a different question. Sorry.
Anybody go to the Griffith Observatory? So you can actually get these portable, inflatable planetariums. So I know somebody at Cornell who did that. When you open the door to go in, it would kind of collapse, and then when you close it, it would inflate itself back up again. They have these really fancy projectors, and so you can control what's being projected onto the ceiling. And so you could do things like, you can take the sky and rotate it 180 degrees. And then you can put a bird under that sky during migration season, and you can see which way it orients. So if it's following the stars somehow, it should flip 180 degrees as well, and that's exactly what they do. Real birds. So they put them into these special cages. I'll talk about that in just a sec. So not only that, but they can control portions of the sky. So not only can you say, well, it's the sky, but you can say, well, is it the North Star? Right, so you can turn off everything except the North Star. You can say, is it the area around the North Star by so many degrees? They can do that. Okay, so, yeah.
Is it innate or are they taught?
It's innate. So they can do it on the first time that these are migratory birds now. The first time they have to migrate, they have this mechanism available to them. They don't have to learn it. Now, they don't know exactly where they're going, right, because they've never been there before. So they go to a general area. Later, when they make the return trip a year later, they can go to the exact same spot. So then it becomes migration and homing. So my red-winged blackbirds, for example, once they establish territory, as long as that male was alive, he'd come back to that territory, to that very spot. So it's a pretty small area. Yeah.
Is that like the swallows do that too, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. They say that the swallows come back to Capistrano on the same date.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true.
But that would be around the same, right?
It's probably close to that. So my red-wings, for example, this was in Indiana. They were usually back by February 28th, but sometimes they came back early February. Sometimes the weather was really lousy, so they waited until March.
So we take-
But it's always around the same time.
That's what we can do next Tuesday.
Yeah, February 19th.
Yeah. Next Tuesday, take a field trip.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's an idea.
These are going
Drive down.
stops along the way. Do you know the longest non-stop migration?
Yeah, thousands of miles.
But do you know what bird it is?
There's a curlew, I think, that goes 6,000 miles, or a tern, or something that goes 6,000 miles nonstop. That's pretty impressive. Day and night.
Without eating. Wow.
Yeah, they don't stop. They don't eat. They just fly. Yeah. So they have to fuel up for that, so they go what's called hyperphagic. They eat a lot. They eat a lot for days and days, and then they take off and go. And they don't stop until they get there. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so back to that planetarium. So how do you study that? Well, they don't really like it if you're standing there watching them. These are wild birds. So they're put in what's called a Kramer cage. Now, a German ornithologist named Kramer invented a special cage with open to the sky on top, and and you could put a funnel-shaped piece of filter paper, so like this, in the bottom, and at the very bottom was an ink pad. So the bird would stand on the ink pad, and then, because it's at night, if you cage a bird, it gets restless at night during migration season, and not only does it, so it starts jumping around. Not only is it jumping around, but it's jumping around in a particular direction. So it's called migratory restlessness, Zugenruhe, and it's oriented. So you can put the bird in the cage under the planetarium sky, and then the next day you go and you see where the ink marks are. And if it's oriented this way and it's trying to go that way, all the ink marks are that way. If you do this, all the ink marks are that way. If you do that, yeah, so it's pretty clever. So that's one way. Now there are more technologically advanced ways. So especially for nocturnal migrants, right? These are birds that only fly at night when they're migrating. Otherwise, they're active during the day. You can actually follow them with radar. Yeah. So the big NASA radar at Wallops Island, that's been used to track birds. There was a very famous biologist who worked where I was a postdoc, Donald Griffin, and he bought a surplus anti-aircraft radar from the Korean War, and he could target individual birds with that radar, and he could follow them, across the sky with this radar to see the direction, speed, altitude, and whether they're just going in a straight line or are they doing this. So lots of different ways. You can also put transmitters on them with GPS and have satellites follow them now. So there are all kinds of new innovations. Very interesting work. That guy, Don Griffin, also was the one who discovered that bats use echolocation. And he did that during World War II. So sonar systems are the same. So of course he was investigated by the FBI because they thought he was stealing sonar secrets, but he was just observing bats. Okay, so what about those feathers, right? We said feathers are characteristics of birds. Well, we know from fossil evidence that feathers evolved before birds, so they evolved in reptiles. And we're reasonably sure that those reptiles that initially evolved feathers could not fly. So the origin of feathers has nothing to do with flight, right? They probably had to do with thermoregulation. Feathers, as we know as humans, are excellent insulators. So when it's cold, we put on a down coat, and down coats are very light, but they're very warm because inside the coat are these down feathers, like those, and they trap a lot of air. So they have these big air spaces. Those air spaces get warmed up by our body heat and it holds it. So feathers probably first evolved for insulation, thermoregulation, and then evolved other functions, as we call them, following that. So this is the original adaptation, was thermoregulation. And then that was what's called co-opted. For other functions, that's now called an exaptation. So not an adaptation, but an exaptation. So what are some of the things? Well, we talked about thermoregulation. Modern birds also use feathers for thermoregulation. They use their down feathers. They also can control the height of the insulation layer by controlling the contour feathers, the outer feathers. So when it's comfortable, the feathers are pretty relaxed, so they're kind of laying down. When it gets cold, each of those feathers is attached to a little muscle. They can raise those feathers so they can increase the insulation layer, the thickness. So now if you see a bird early in the morning, it looks like it's puffed up. That's why. It's trying to stay warm. And so it's really fluffed up, it's down. And then when it's really hot, they can erect them all the way so that air can actually get in between and get down to the skin. Because birds can't pant, or birds can't sweat. So the only way to get rid of heat is through the skin or by panting. Feathers also work in communication, and that's a very important part of bird communication. So here's the classic example, the peacock, the male. It's got these elaborate tail feathers with eye spots and everything. People like to have those in their houses. You know, you get them and you put them in like a vase. Questions about that? So we're going to talk about that a little more. Oops. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. Don't do this, by the way. I picked this up near my house. You're not allowed to do that. That's against the law. So this is a turkey vulture flight feather. I know it's a flight feather, not a tail feather, because it looks like that. It's asymmetric. So the leading edge is narrow. Here's the rachis, the central rib. It's pretty narrow that way, but it's broad over here. That's the trailing edge. So narrow over here, broad over here. And we'll talk about how that works in a minute. This looks more like a tail feather because the two sides are pretty symmetric, same width. And interestingly, with these flight feathers especially, if you take this area and blow it up, it looks like that. It has a lot of structure to it. So each of the little barbules has these hooks like Velcro. So what that enables it to do is each one hooks to the next one, which gives it a lot of integrity. So that's what enables the flapping motion to generate lift and thrust. But of course they can get pulled apart, right? So the birds have to do things to maintain their feathers. Feathers do lots of things. We said, are used for insulation. They're also used for protection, so ducks are waterproof because of their feathers. They do other things as well, but they have to take care of them because feathers are dead, right? So they're not living tissue. They have to be replaced once or twice or more a year. So if the flight feather like this becomes interrupted like that, it's not going to work very well, so they have to preen them. So it puts it right back. It rehooks the little barbules. It's like undoing and doing your Velcro. They also have to oil them, keep them waterproof. And they do that with this little gland. Yeah?
So Ken, you said, we can't pick up a feather, but as docents who are educating, usually we can have a feather to demonstrate what you're talking about.
Right, so I'm not allowed to have this, but the Nature Center has the proper permits. So I can bring this, which is what I'm doing here, and put it in this box, which is the bird nature box. I'll show about that after the break. And so that's legal, but not because I have the permit, I don't. So you can't possess a wild bird or any product of it, a nest, an egg, a feather. All of that is illegal. It's a violation of federal law. Now, I never heard of anybody being arrested for picking up a feather or picking up a baby bird, saving a baby bird, but it is illegal unless you have permits. Bill, did you have a question? No? Oh, yeah.
There was a bird here that they, I think at the crow, or that they have here now,
Uh-huh.
that it was taken away from somebody
Right.
because they had it illegal or whatever.
Yeah. So we have all these permits to allow us to keep wild birds. And not all birds are covered, so certain birds are not. Chickens obviously are not covered. Starlings are not covered because they're imports. So there are some exceptions. Okay, so that gland right there is on the belly. It's a preen gland or uropygial gland, and what the bird does, it takes its bill and kind of massages it, gets it to extrude a little bit of oil, and then it puts that on the feathers. So that's what makes the feathers waterproof. Otherwise, they're not waterproof. And you see birds doing that kind of thing, or pulling their bill along a feather. You see them doing that all the time because it's really important for them to keep those feathers in good shape.
So how do they know when to the gland X to release that?
They have to massage the gland to get it to release the oil. They put the bill on either side of it and squeeze. It's like popping a pimple, I guess.
How dry it is, or how does it feel?
But they do it all the time. So I'm not sure what you mean by know. I have no idea, no way to know what they know.
You see a duck on the pond constantly.
Yeah, they just do it all the time. It's very important. Okay, so, but one of the other things we noticed about feathers is, and we saw that with the Anas hummingbird, they can be really colorful, right? Amazingly so. But, of course, the ornithologist wants to know, well, how do they do that? What's the mechanism? So it turns out there are a number of different ways that bird feathers can look colored. The simplest way is for them to have a pigment, right? So we don't have these here. This is one of my birds that I miss from Wisconsin and Indiana. It's a northern cardinal male. The males are bright red with a black face. Females are kind of a rusty color red, just as pretty but a different red. And what they do is they take pigments, colors, and deposit them in the feathers. Right, so you can actually leach the pigment out by treating it with alcohol or something like that. So you can actually remove the pigments and study them, and some people do that. So these are reds and browns, colors like that. These are often carotenoids. Those are plant products, and they produce yellows, reds, and oranges. There also are melanin pigments. So those produce blacks, browns, and yellows.
And
Yep.
are you saying it's something that they eat that produces this color?
So some of the things they have to ingest because they can't make them, and some they can make on their own. So for example, the house finches that we have around here, they're red. They cannot make that red, they have to eat it. So in the house finches in Hawaii, they're not red because apparently they don't have the right kinds of seeds to make the red. And also, females like the redder males. So even those Hawaiian females who've never seen a red male, if you show them a red male, they'll go crazy. There are also things called porphyrins. These are modified amino acids, and they produce pinks, browns, reds, and greens. Okay, so those are all different pigments, either from the diet or from the bird's own metabolism. But other colors are not pigments at all. So this is another bird we don't have here, I don't think, the indigo bunting. These used to come to a feeder by my house sometimes. This is what's called a structural color. So it's the structure of the feather itself, not a pigment at all, that makes it look blue. And that's one of the reasons why birds that are blue, that blue varies depending on the angle of the sun and where you are relative to the bird. So scrub jays around here are blue on the back, right? They don't always look so blue. So sometimes they look kind of gray, right? And that's because it's this spongy layer down here that refracts, breaks up the light into components, and then you see the blue part back. That's sent back to your eye. So that's why birds that are blue, not bluebirds, birds that are blue, that blue varies. And then another way is there's a hummingbird, iridescence. So iridescence is caused by a similar structural mechanism. And again, it depends on the angle. So when we saw that Anas hummingbird on the yucca, it was backlit. So it was very hard. It was a male, it was very hard to see that red gorget, the red on the throat. But if we could get the bird to go on the other side, so by the road, so that the sun is over there, you're here, and the bird's over there, and if it turned and faced you, that red would be brilliant. Now these birds take advantage of that, so when they're courting a female, they'll position themselves so that the sun is reflecting off that gorget and directly into her eyes. So he can really show off that way. Yeah. Yeah. Question?
Blinded by the light.
Exactly. Okay, so what do these colors do for the bird? And obviously one of the important functions, as we call it, is communication. So there's a hummingbird again, and again that light, it's the head and the throat, the gorget, are very colorful because the photographer is here, the bird is there, and the sun is over there. So that's ideal. This is my study species, the red-winged blackbird. The common name only describes the male. The female is brown and streaked. Old females have a little bit of reddish, more like orangish epaulette, it's called. And that's the wrist of the wing. And the males, they show that epaulette for two reasons, two functions. One is to defend the territory, and the other is to attract females. So how do we know that? Well, one way is to catch that bird. You can catch them without hurting them. Take a magic marker, black magic marker, and just blacken it. And remember, they molt, so they'll get a new set of feathers next time they molt. And if you do, I didn't do this, but if you do that, those males lose their territories. So, but we don't really know whether that's because they're no longer recognized as red-winged blackbirds, or whether they just don't have the red, and so that they're not effective in defending their territories. Also, if you show the males to a female, you can give her a choice between a male with a dark epaulette, or half an epaulette, or a full epaulette, or even a brightened epaulette. I did that experiment. And they like the bigger, brighter epaulette, whatever it is. Even if it's bigger than normal, they prefer that. So I did an experiment in the field where I caught birds, and with half of them I just swabbed them with a dry Q-tip. With the others, I either took a magic marker and made it brighter, or took a gray magic marker and made it a little duller. And I think I didn't dull it enough. It was hardly noticeable. That didn't seem to have any effect. But the brighter males, they're definitely more attractive to females. We did the laboratory study to show that. But when I released those males in the wild, all of a sudden all these other males were trespassing on their territories, harassing them nonstop, and many of them lost their territories temporarily. But the next year when they had their epaulets back, they were back.
Weren't you guilty interfering with their sex life?
No. Anytime you do research like that, you have to get approval, right? So there are committees, and the committee comprises professionals and also lay people. So on my committee, there was a veterinarian, there was somebody from the local area, and somebody from the college. And you have to submit a proposal for what you want to do, and you have to explain what's the benefit of doing that research and what's the potential harm. And then the committee balances those two things against each other. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the reasons that birds use bright colors in the communication system is to attract a mate, right? And that's, in species like the red-winged blackbird, that's true for the males. In other species, the difference in coloration can be reversed. So in some species, the female is the bright one and the male is the less colorful one. But apparently that kind of thing is related to what's called the mating system of the bird. And what's really interesting about birds is that they have a variety of different kinds of so-called mating systems. So if you look at this right here, this is a little depiction of the different ways that bird species have relationships with each other, males and females, to produce offspring. So here's my species, the red-winged blackbird, and it's the classic example of what's called polygyny, polygyny, many females. So males come back to the breeding area before females, they set up and defend territories, and then females arrive and settle on territories and build nests. On my study area, a single male could have up to 5 females nesting at the same time. In Washington State, there was a study that had 15 females nesting on one territory at the same time. Actually, the author claimed that it was 30, but his student and I, these birds were not banded. So he said, well, how does he know it's really one bird? So we said it's probably 15. But anyway, that's pretty impressive. There are also species like, that's scrub jay, that are monogamous. So one male, one female, they work together to raise young. In the red-winged blackbird, the male doesn't do much to raise young, although he will defend them against predators. So if you're walking by, I used to get these emergency ornithology calls all the time. I was walking by the river and this red-winged blackbird attacked me. Well, yeah, but that's because you were near his nest and you're big and you're scary. So he was trying to drive you away. So all you need to do is turn and face him, and he won't hit you. But if your back is to him, he might whack you on the back of the head. I've been struck 10,000 times. I'm fine. Here's a cardinal. Look, one female, many males. So that's called polyandry, many males. Now what happens in that system is that one female pairs with one male, so they look like they're monogamous, but then if you do DNA studies on the offspring, they'll have multiple sires, multiple fathers. So they're socially monogamous, but genetically polyandrous. Now, when those same methods, genetic methods, were applied to red-winged blackbirds, it was discovered, and it was first discovered by a wildlife biologist who was trying to come up with a way to control the number of redwings because they're destructive. You know, they eat sunflowers, and so all those sunflower farmers in the Dakotas, they didn't like redwings very much. So, and they form these big flocks that are a big nuisance in the winter because they're pooping all over the place and people don't like them. So this wildlife biologist said, well, I'm just going to catch all the males and give them vasectomies and then release them, and that should take care of the problem, right? They can't reproduce. Those females still reproduced. So how could that happen? Well, because they're mating with other males, too. So actually, this is only the social mating system of red-winged blackbirds, one male, many females on one territory. But each of those nests could have offspring with one sire, the territory owner, or one sire who's a neighbor, not the territory owner, or multiple sires even. They could have, if they have 4 nestlings, they could have 4 different sires. So actually, technically, this mating system genetically is polygynandry or polygynandry. So multiple females, multiple males. We have the opposite of polygyny is this is a jacana. It's a lily trotter. Look at those toes. So it can walk on lily pads because it's got those long toes. It can spread its weight out, and the lily pad can actually support it then. Here, the female is big compared to the male and colorful compared to the male. Females come back, establish and defend a territory, and multiple males come onto the territory. The female will lay a clutch of eggs for one male, then leave him to take care of those eggs and babies, attract another mate, lay a clutch of eggs for him, and maybe even attract a third mate and lay a clutch of eggs for him. The males do all the parental care. The males incubate, the males raise the, feed the young, yeah. Some birds, not this is a barn swallow, not those in particular, but some swallows are colonial. So they form these big, big groups with many, many, many nests pretty much in the same place. And it's called coloniality if there's a lot of habitat, but all the birds are jammed into one little place. So redwings are sometimes called colonial, but I think that's incorrect because I think they're jammed together because they're in marshes, and a lot of marshes are pretty small, and that's the only available nesting habitat, so all the females have to go there. We also see some weird things. So, you remember Horton the elephant? Horton? What did Horton do? Yeah, he hoarded who, but what else did he do? Remember Lazy Maisie? Lazy Maisie was this female bird that left Horton with an egg, and Horton took care of it, hatched it. Now, Disney changed it so that the thing that hatched out looked like an elephant, but that doesn't happen. But there are systems where a bird, in this case a brown-headed cowbird, will lay its egg in the nest of a different species. That's called brood parasitism. Cowbird, and we have brown-headed cowbirds around here. Cowbirds never build nests. They never lay their eggs in their own nests. They never take care of their own young, never. They always rely on a host like this. It's probably a robin, it's probably a bluebird or something, to take care of that. Now, the robin is a bad choice because the robins will recognize that and toss that egg out. But red-winged blackbirds, for example, maybe they recognize it, maybe they don't, but they just accept the egg. They raise it like their own. I even encountered a brood of 4 nestlings on my study at a red-winged nest. 4 cowbirds, no redwings.
In Hanson Dam, they have a cowbird capture. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's like a little enclosure, and they put food out.
Yep.
And birds can get in, and then at night they go in, and they release all the birds that are not cowbirds, and they capture the cowbirds.
And kill them. Yeah. So there are many cowbird control areas because in some areas there are so many cowbirds that certain species of hosts are severely negatively affected by that parasitism.
Do they know that's not their egg, the bird who's nesting?
Well, that's a really good question. So it's hard to know what they know, but you can see whether, for example, they reject that egg. Only a few species do that. So like my species, the red-winged blackbird, is an acceptor, although I had some evidence that they can recognize a difference. So then the question is, well, if they can tell it's not their own egg, why do they accept it? That's a really interesting question. Right, so,
Very accepting. They
yeah.
don't care. Just shove a bunch under there.
Well, and there are different kinds of parasitism. So one is members of the same species parasitizing each other. So that happens in ducks, for example. And there, maybe they can't tell the difference because they look the same. The eggs look the same.
Ken, maybe you're going to cover this, but just before we move on, I've always heard, our common bird in the park is the the acorn woodpecker. And I've heard they have a very complex social mating, system. Are they similar to the red-winged blackbirds where they share, they mate with many pairs or whatever?
So acorn woodpeckers are a classic example of what's called cooperative breeding. I didn't talk about that before. But in acorn woodpeckers, including the ones here, they live in these family groups of, say, up to 15 or so. And there's one nest on a territory, and 3 or 4 females might all lay eggs in that same nest. And they all take turns incubating the eggs, and then almost all the birds feed the young. So that seems like really nice, except the females, when they lay, when a female goes in to lay an egg, she takes one out and throws it away. So it's not that nice. They also do a weird thing where they lay what's called a runt egg, so a little tiny egg that's not viable. Nobody really knows why they do that. Maybe they are hoping that's the one that gets tossed out. I don't know. We don't have these in North America, but that is a fledgling European cuckoo. It's the one in the clock, right? They also are brood parasites. They never build nests and they never lay their own eggs or raise their own eggs. And they tend to choose hosts that are considerably smaller than they are. Not only do they lay their eggs in a different species nest, so this is a sedge warbler nest, there's a newly hatched cuckoo, helpless cuckoo, but when it hatches out, it holds its wings like this, and it backs around until it bumps into something, and then it backs up to the edge of the nest and flips it out. So if you go to this nest, you'll find underneath it, so this is in a marsh, in the water you'll find a lot of eggs or nestlings or both. And all those ones that were tossed out were the host ones. So the only bird left of the nest is the cuckoo. Instead of 4 or 5 sedge warbler nestlings, there's one cuckoo nestling. So the parents are working like crazy to take care of and raise this one cuckoo. And look at that. That's an adult host feeding a fledgling cuckoo. That cuckoo is much, much bigger than its host. So then you wonder, why don't the parents know what's going on? Well, do you know the children's book, Flap Your Wings? P.D. Eastman, Flap Your Wings. So it's a story in Florida. This boy's walking along the path and he finds an egg on the ground. So he looks up, he sees a nest, so he picks up the egg, climbs up, puts the egg in the nest. Well, it was an alligator egg. But of course, in the book, the parents come back and the male says, ooh, that's not our egg, it's way too big. And the mother says, but it's an egg, it's in our nest, so you take care of it. So that's apparently the rule of thumb that the birds use. It's an egg, it's in your nest, or it's a nestling. And later on, when the alligator hatches out, it's an alligator. The father says, look at the mouth on that thing, that's not our baby. And the mother says, well, it's in our nest, it's hungry, you feed it. So that's apparently what these guys do.
So it's a fallacy that if you see a baby bird on the ground and you pick it up and put it in the nest, that the mother bird will not continue to feed it?
Well, if it's the wrong species, it probably won't. But, part of my work as an ornithologist was to put identifying bands on birds. And I would do that to all nestlings that reach day 9 of the nestling period because they start to leave the nest after that. So I'm handling these birds. For some studies, I even took small blood samples from them. So that would take maybe several minutes per nestling. And all that time, I never had a female desert a nest. Now, that's not to say females cannot smell. So birds, for many, many years, it was often said, and you can even find it in textbooks. With rare exceptions, birds have a very poor sense of smell. That's being disputed now. That's no longer accepted. So we now know that birds do have a sense of smell. Maybe it's not as important for certain things to them as other senses. It's a good question. Okay, so this is a little technical thing. Ornithologists talk about bills and beaks. The public talks about beaks. So this is a beak. These are all bills. So bill is the more general term. And the shape of the bill is a reflection of the food that the bird eats. So an experienced birder will look at the head and try to identify the bill. And that gives you a lot of information about what kind of bird it is, how it makes its living, and eventually what is it, what kind of bird is it. And I used to do this with my college students. There's an interesting activity you can use where you can have an analogy. So you can take kitchen implements and say, well, these are designed to do different things, just like bird bills are designed to do different things. And so you can give a variety of items to manipulate. And you can say, well, which one of these things is best suited for manipulating that thing? And you can use that to make the point that birds are doing the same thing. And this works with kids too. So it would work with even 4- and 5-year-olds. I have a clock here. Okay, so I'm going to just do this and then we'll stop for our break. Then we'll come back and I'll finish up. So I mentioned before that birds have, they have to get information from the environment. They use their sensory organs to do that. So some of their sensory abilities are very similar to ours. Mammals and reptiles, after all, are pretty closely related. But some are quite different. So bird hearing is actually pretty similar to our hearing. When I was a postdoc, I had a colleague who studied bird hearing, so he would take parakeets because they were, domesticated, and he would do audiograms on them. So they were trained to bite on a bar when they heard something, And then so he would play different sounds and see if they bit the bar or not. And so you can actually see, well, what's the lowest frequency they can hear, what's the highest frequency they can hear, how loud does it have to be at a particular frequency. That's the same thing that when you go in for a hearing test that is done to you. But some birds have much better hearing. So that some birds can hear lower sounds that we can hear, infrasounds. Pigeons, for example, can hear very, very low sounds. So supposedly a pigeon in Pennsylvania can hear the ocean, can hear the waves in the ocean. I don't know if that's true. You can also ask about vision. So one way to talk about vision is to look at where their eyes are placed. And it's a little different in birds because most, not all birds, are unable to move their eyes in their skulls. The eyes are fixed in place. So like the Sierra, the owl that Jack brings out, that's that really big owl with the yellow eyes. Those eyes cannot move. So the only way that she can see to her left or to her right is to move her head. And she can actually swivel 270 degrees. She can't turn all the way around. She can't look directly behind her. But she can see she can twist her head a long way through the arc. So that's because both of her eyes are placed in the front of her skull, so she has to turn to see to the side. Other birds have eyes placed sort of on the sides of the head, so they can see to the sides. They can see in front of them to some extent, although they might not be able to see very much with both eyes in the same place in front. So they don't really have very good stereoscopic vision. By the way, it's been shown in ducks that ducks have eyes on the sides of their heads. They use those independently. So one eye is attached to one side of the brain, the other eye is attached to the other side of the brain. They can actually put one side of the brain to sleep and leave the other side awake and watching for predators. And then what they do is they sit in a group. Some are facing that way, some facing that way, that way, that way. Yeah, pretty good. If only we could do that. Just think how efficient we could be. Dolphins, for example, have to be able to do that because they have to be able to breathe all the time, and they have to come to the surface, so they sleep half the brain at a time. Amazing. And then there's the woodcock. They have a really strange placement, so their eyes are actually toward the back of the head. So they can actually see behind them. Some birds also have, we have what's called a fovea in the retina, right? That's where the focus of the light coming in through your lens, that's where the light is focused. And we have a high density of sensory receptors there, color receptors. Many birds have two. So one for close, one for distance. And they're put in different places. So if you watch a bird, if it's looking at a distance, it'll look directly that way because it's using one fovea. But if it's something on the ground, they look like that, right? They turn, the head is pointing that way, but they're looking down this way because they're using the other fovea, the close fovea. And I mentioned color vision. Birds have much better color vision than humans. They have 4 color receptors, and they're spread uniformly across the spectrum so that birds can see ultraviolet colors that we cannot see at all. So this is sort of speculative, but based on what the bird's sensory photoreceptors can see, this is what this bird would look like to us. This is what the same bird looks like to another bird. So what looks like just a drab old bird to us maybe isn't drab at all to a bird. Dennis?
Say, Ken, you mentioned earlier the bird that flies 6,000 miles without stopping. And it just made me think, does that bird have the ability to put part of his brain to sleep that isn't needed for flight?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that that's been studied.
Okay.
You'd have to study that for every bird you're interested in. Helen?
When you're showing bird vision, does that work for all birds? Or does the amount of vision they have vary when it comes to seeing color?
It varies. We talked about homing and long-distance migration, and I forgot to talk about it, but one of the ways that birds can figure out what compass direction is, they can actually have a literal compass. They can detect the Earth's magnetic field. So they know which way is north and south. So there's a bird, there's the Earth's magnetic field. The challenge is that every 10,000 years or so that flips, so they have to readjust somehow. But they're still around. Birds evolved probably 150 million years ago, so they've done pretty well. And then we know that certain birds, like this vulture, have exceptionally good senses of smell. Right, so they can detect a rotting carcass from really far away, and that's when you see them all gathering. They always show that in the movies. All the vultures are gathered. But we now know that other birds that we thought couldn't smell, they do. They can. And the sense of smell is very important. And then finally, I mentioned about bird hearing. Well, I used to do this little demonstration with my college students. I'd have a student sit in a chair, close the eyes, and then I would take 2 spoons and click them. And I would say, when I click this, you point where it's coming from. Right? So if I did, can I use you? If I did this, she could point accurately. That's on that side over there, But if I did this, she might go, or if I did this. So what's the problem? Why is it easy when it's over here, but not easy when it's here?
Because of the symmetry of our ears.
Yeah, because your ears are on either side of your head, and so there are 2 cues that you could use to detect direction. One is which side is louder, and the other, this is amazing, is when does it get there? So even a pretty close sound, close source, it takes longer to get around to the other side. So you can compare the time of arrival difference. But if it's right in the midline, you lose those cues. But certain animals depend on location ability by sound. They have to be able to detect things accurately, even if they're in the midline, the sagittal line. So there's an owl skull, and what do you notice about the ear holes? They're asymmetrical, one's high, one's low. So they can actually detect a moving rodent in total darkness, even if it's directly in front of them. And they can fly directly from their perch to where that moving rodent is going to be, not where it is, where it's going to be. They spread their talons out like that, they hit the ground, and they catch it. And they're very, very accurate. So this work was done with barn owls, Roger the barn owl, and filmed in total darkness with infrared cameras. Pretty amazing. So birds really do have good sensory systems. And on that, yeah, go ahead.
Along the line of sensory systems, I think, you see birds flying up the sky, a whole bunch of sparrows, thousands of them. They're moving around together, never miss a beat. Who's got the control? They got a remote control up there or something?
So have you seen these, what they're called murmurations?
Yeah.
So huge flocks, often of starlings, thousands of birds, and they're flying like one.
Yeah.
They just do what everybody else does. They're just really sensitive to, what the other birds are doing, and when one turns, they all turn. Yeah.
So, I've seen birds do that, but I've seen birds do something else. The cliff swallows, they all fly together, and then all of a sudden they're all over the place, and then as if somebody says, hey guys, and all of a sudden they're all back together and flying together. And it's just so instantaneous that they know when to split and they know when to, it's almost like they've choreographed it.
It seems like that, yeah. So what's going on? Hard to know, but maybe somebody's detected a predator. And so if there's a predator like a Cooper's hawk or something that can catch birds on the wing, you go together.
Scattering is when they're foraging
Yeah.
in the field.
So they'll forage separately. So that's searching for food, right? And that's better because, the flying insects that they're catching are not necessarily in a clump like that. Yeah.
So pelicans at the beach, they fly in a V formation and then they can go down and then like 6 inches above
Right.
the waves coming in. What is it that they can sense how close they are to the water? Is it their vision? Or is it that, do they have like a built-in sonar that can keep them from-
As far as I know, those birds don't use echolocation, so it's probably vision. The V formation is interesting because that echelon formation, the V or the stacked like that, it's aerodynamically more efficient for everybody except the first bird. The first bird is working harder, so what they do is they trade off. So the leader stays there for a little while and then flies to the end. The next one picks it up. Yeah. There's a question over here? Break time. So remember, there are lots of different people who are interested in birds. I mentioned a few before. There are bird watchers. There are birders. They're not the same. Ornithologists and many, many others. Okay, so people sometimes ask me, well, are you a bird watcher? And I say no. They say, are you a birder? And I say, sort of. I'm really an ornithologist. So what's the difference? Well, ornithologists are people who study them birds scientifically. So they erect hypotheses, they test them, that kind of thing. I'm not suggesting that you become one. But there are bird watchers and there are birders. Has anybody seen the movie The Big Year?
Yes. Yeah.
Those are birders. So birders are dedicated to seeing different species of birds. A true birder can tell you to the species how many are on the life list, how many are on the big day list, how many are on the this year list. I even ran into some birders from the UK who had a special bird while pooping list.
That's
Yeah.
funny.
Okay, so that's a birder. A bird watcher is also somebody who's interested in birds, but more casually. So if you put up a feeder or if you modify your garden to attract birds, you're a bird watcher. Now, all of you can contribute, right? Because I think it's this weekend is the beginning of the great backyard bird count.
Yeah, it starts tomorrow. Right?
Yeah. So if you go to the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology website, you can get information about how to do that. There's a little training session that you have to do. You only have to watch for 15 minutes, and then you just send that information in. That's called citizen science, so that information can be used by ornithologists to study various things. Also, when I do bird walks, I use what's called eBird. That's another citizen science type app. It will keep a record of all that you saw, and then you can submit that to a central location. All of those lists are then compiled, and in many cases, that information has been used by other ornithologists to study something about the distribution of birds or how the numbers are changing, that kind of thing. So very valuable. So obviously the starting point is being able to identify birds. I am not an expert. I am not a true birder. I don't consider myself a true birder. I have no idea what my life list is. No birder would say that. You'd never hear that coming from a birder. I'm what I call a casual birder. Yeah, I like it. I do it. But I don't go out of my way to do it, and I don't spend a whole lot of money doing it. So there are people who will spend money to fly around the world to increase the daylight hours in a single day. So they're doing a big day count, right? So they get on the jet and they fly with the sun, and they can increase the number of daylight hours. And they go to many different places, and that increases the number of birds they can see. That's not me. Okay, but for bird ID, especially if you're a novice, there are several aids that you can use to help you identify birds. And I think the single most important thing is some kind of a visual enhancement device. So I use binoculars. These days there are other things as well. There are monoculars. I know on our bird hikes, a couple of people, Ashok Rushan's husband is one of them, who use monoculars. So that's just use one eye. So that way you don't have to adjust the pivot and worry about the diopters and all that kind of stuff. That picture on the left, top left there is a kind of a typical birding picture. So know looking at the same thing. Often the mouth is open. I've noticed, I don't know if this is a rule or what, but typically birders don't wear sunglasses. They often wear glasses because they need them, but they need to be able to see colors accurately, so sunglasses kind of screw that up, I guess. Another aid is a spotting scope. I brought mine. I don't bring this on bird hikes because it's pretty cumbersome to carry, but this is a zoom scope, so you can get really close And when I studied red-winged blackbirds for 44 years, I did detailed observations of individual birds, and I had a whole notation system for keeping track of what they were doing, how often they were doing it, all that. I did my observations through a spotting scope, and I just used paper and pencil methods to record what they were doing. These days, there are electronic systems that will do that much better. So they're called event recorders. You can put them on your phone, and they just record. You just develop a code, and it will record what the bird is doing, and then you can compile those data later. I had to go through every one of my data sheets that night, go through them. So if I did a 15-minute observation, it would take me 30 minutes to go through that, to compile it every night. Yeah. I was a field biologist, so my studies were almost always in the field. Other people study birds in the laboratory. That's fine. Both are legitimate. So there's, on the bottom left is somebody using a spotting scope. Now notice that one, the setup is different. So this one is just a straight line, right? Focus, zoom. That one is an angled eyepiece. And one advantage of that is you can buy an adapter and put your phone camera on there. And you can use the telescope then as a super telephoto lens. And you don't have to carry a separate telephoto lens. Now, often I use photographs here taken by Gary Park. So if you've gone on bird walks with us, he always brings his camera with him. He's got a lens that's this long, and he just carries that. But he's got an interesting rig. So he's got this little thing that goes around his waist. It's got a little pouch in the front. He has a monopod, so he attaches the camera to that monopod, and he shoves the end into that pouch, and then it's right here. Right, so he doesn't have to lift it up. He doesn't have to lug it around. It's very easy for him to carry that. So that's a really nice rig. And his lens is huge. So he can see things through his camera lens that I can't see very well through my binoculars because he has much more magnification. And if he takes a really good picture, he could send it to me. And if it's on my phone then, I can submit that picture to Merlin. And Merlin will tell me what it is. So we used that pretty recently. We had a bird that we could not identify. We looked at it over and over again. Gary had a great photographer staring at the photograph. It wasn't until like 2 days later that he said, I think it's an orange crown warbler. So he sent me the picture. I submitted it to Merlin Bird ID. Sure enough, orange crown warbler. So that works too. But you have to have a really good picture, and it has to be big. It has to fill the screen. Okay, so I brought a few binoculars with me. Oh, and then there are bird guides. So there are books. I don't use them anymore. There are books in the library in the docent room. These are all.
What's your favorite?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Because people, birders, the real ones, get into huge arguments about what's the best field guide. So I avoid that. The one I learned on is the Peterson guide. That's this one. Peterson guide is hand-drawn, hand-painted images. Roger Tory Peterson was an exceptional artist. He drew all of these. One disadvantage is that there are two books, one for the, quote, east, meaning east of the Rockies, one for the west, meaning west of the Rockies. So you would, for here, you'd use the Western Peterson guide. The other is the other competitor. I don't think I brought it with me. Oh, is the Robbins Field Guide. It's actually many, many authors. This is a very old one. This is the original. The reason I don't use them so much is that they're cumbersome. So they don't really fit in a pocket. You have to put it in your backpack maybe. Or birders have these nifty little pouches that you can buy for a lot of money. And so that you can whip it out of the pouch and use it. So I brought some others too, and you can look at them. One is a little cheapy Birds of California field guide. I have the Audubon guide. The Audubon guide is photographs, not drawings, and it's organized by color. So because I learned on Peterson, this drives me crazy. I cannot use it. Because my species, the red-winged blackbird, males are black with red epaulets, females are brown and streaked. They're not in the same place in this book. right? Because black birds are in one place and brown birds are in a different place. Yeah, but a lot of people like this. There's a Sibley guide. I didn't bring one with me. That's very popular. What did you have, Michael?
Oh, I've got the Peterson Field Guide for Hummingbirds in North America.
Yeah, there are even more specialized ones.
And I have at home, I have the National Geographic Birds of Southern California.
Okay, this one is,
No, I'm more of a bird watcher.
this one I bought recently from Cornell. This is all about birds, California edition. So it's got photographs, it's got little text blurbs explaining about them. Again, you can come up and look at these. And then I just want to put in a plug. You don't have to spend $20, although you can spend easily $20. You can go into the gift shop and spend $5 and get a laminated, small, pocket-size bird guide, right? $5, and you're supporting the Nature Center.
And you get a discount.
And if you're a docent, you get a 10% discount, so you get 50 cents off.
eBay and Age Books and a couple other places have a lot of these older guides on a really inexpensive.
Right.
Free shipping.
You can even find used copies, you know, so if they're in good shape, that's a way to save some money.
Thrift books, I got this for $14 and this is a $30 book.
All right, so I also brought some binoculars, and again, you're free to come up and look at these. I wanted to go over some binocular basics, and I will talk about apps in a minute. Okay, so when you look at a pair of binoculars, there are 2 or 3 numbers that will be thrown at you. So for example, the ones I use, the ones I was using this morning, right? Can you read the numbers right there?
8 by 42.
So 8x42. The first number, 8, is the magnification. So when you look through this, what you're seeing is 8 times larger than what you would see with your eye. 42 is the size, the diameter of the objective lens. The bigger the lens, the more light it's gathering, right? So more light is better than less light, but the bigger the lens, the heavier the binocular. And if you feel this, that's not light, right? It's pretty heavy. So some people, the less expensive binoculars typically are 7 by 35, something like that, right? You can get smaller ones, you can get bigger ones. My other pair of Leicas, this is the brand that I have, are 7s, 7 by 42. So I'll put both of them here. These are both very expensive. So I don't think you need to spend over $1,000 on a pair of binoculars.
The cameras are really very expensive.
These are also very expensive. These are Zeiss binoculars. Now, the advantage of there are several advantages of an expensive pair of binoculars. One is the quality of the lens. The other is the coating on the lens. And the third thing is the quality of the construction. So and that obviously gets better and better the more money you spend. So we talked about magnification and we talked about the objective lens, so 8 by 42. The other number you sometimes see is the field of view. It'll say like 6 degrees. So that's, when you look through the binoculars, that's how much of the 360 degrees you can see through the binoculars. The other disadvantage of high magnification is it's a narrower field of view. So you can see less and less of the area around you as you increase the magnification. So with my spotting scope, for example, I'm looking at a very small patch of the sky, but I want to have the bird as big as possible, right? So that's why, and there's a zoom on there, so I can adjust that. Okay, now there are some other questions. So that's field of view. There's a weird word there, poro. So I don't have any poro binoculars. You might have some. So you want to hold that up? So see the configuration there? The eyepieces are close together and the objective lenses are far apart. So obviously there are prisms in there that gather light from here and then bring them to your eye. The other are roof prisms. Those are the kinds that I showed you, or like you have roof prism binoculars, like these. There are prisms in there, but they're in line, so they don't actually deflect the light out or in and then to your eye. So that's just personal preference. Some people like the feel of a Poro setup. Most of the ones you see today are roof prisms because they're a little more compact. And then I do not recommend zoom binoculars because you don't have nearly as good control of the focus. The zoom range is really limited. It's like that. Whereas a center focus knob, you can turn it many, many times to change the focus. And there are now pretty expensive digital binoculars with cameras built into them. I don't recommend them unless you just want to document what you're seeing. Because the picture quality for such an expensive item is not great. So if you try to blow it up, it's just like blowing up a picture from your phone. It gets all pixelated. So I just don't think it's good enough. If you really want to do that, you could get a spotting scope with an angled eyepiece and buy the adapter and hook your phone up to that. That'd be better. Or you can carry a camera with a big lens. So those are my personal recommendations, but doesn't mean you have to listen to what I say. People also ask me, what brand of binoculars do you recommend? I never answer that question because there are lots and lots of good pairs, lots and lots of good brands. It's all, to me, personal preference. So I remember in my lab, I had these Zeiss and these Leicas out on my table. And a visiting scientist came in and he looked at them both and he said, oh, these Zeiss are much better. And I prefer the Leicas. They're both really good. They're both really expensive. So it's just a matter of personal preference. Now, you don't have to spend huge amounts of money. So I brought in some lower end. So when I started graduate school, I had no money. I had negative money. So, so at first I just borrowed a pair from the department, and they were pretty crappy. And I could barely see through them, they were so bad. So I saved up my pennies. My stipend, my assistantship was $3,000 for the year. Yeah. So I didn't have any money. But I saved up my pennies and I bought a pair of Sears binoculars. I think they were $50. Maybe they were $25. And they were Poro style, so that, they had the bend. And they were 7x50s, so they were big, heavy, clunky binoculars, and they were not very good. Plus, when you buy binoculars, you want to make sure that the ones you buy are fog-proof, waterproof, and shock-proof. So my Leicas, for example, I could drop them, and they'd be fine. I could dunk them, and they'd be fine. And if they get wet, they don't get fogged up inside. And that's because the interior is filled with some kind of a gas, an inert gas like argon or nitrogen or something like that. Right? So you have to pay at least a little bit of money to get that. Now, you can get them for like $100, $150 with those features. So again, you don't have to spend huge amounts of money, but you do have to spend something. These I bought after my Sears binoculars. I just got so frustrated with them. Plus, they got all fogged up. So these are Bushnells. They're not that expensive, $100, $150 maybe. And but for me, back in grad school, $3,000 a year, this was a big purchase. Yeah. So you might want to try these. It has the diopter on the side. It's got eye relief. You can flip these up. If you don't wear glasses, flip them down if you do. So it's got all those. And then this strap is just a camera strap that I bought at Walmart. So the strap that came with it was just this thin little thing that was not comfortable at all. And I didn't think it was very secure. So I just bought this to replace that, and this was a couple of dollars. I lost the strap on my Leicas, or maybe I don't know what happened. So I bought one that says Leica. This was not a couple of dollars. And then finally, when I got these Zeiss, the the outfit that I bought them from threw in these for free. These are little Nikons, right? These are, they're called travel lights. I don't see any numbers on them. So I cannot tell you what the numbers are. There was a little pamphlet that came with it that explained all that. So these are pretty inexpensive, obviously, if they throw them in for free. These are very light. I keep them in my car as emergency binoculars. And they work pretty well. So if you want to try these, feel free. Okay, so if you want to get even less expensive, you can consider used binoculars, but I say caveat emptor. You know what that means? Buyer beware. A lot of the ones that you see like on eBay are really crappy binoculars that they're trying to get rid of. So if you've never heard of the brand, I would say don't bother. But you can get good ones that are used, and they're a lot less expensive. You want to make sure that they're comfortable on you, because they're going to be on you for a long time when you're out birding. Now you can spend lots of money and buy these special harnesses and special packs that the binoculars go into, and they're designed to stay against your chest. So as you're walking, it's not going like this all the time. My wife hates that. Or you can do what I do for nothing. So here's my Leica strap. It's designed to go one way. I put it on. If I'm going to be just walking without watching, I just do that. No problem. So that doesn't cost anything. I like cheap solutions.
How'd that idea go over with your wife?
She doesn't use binoculars. I have a pair for her. She hardly ever uses them. And my recommendation is, well, when I made the slide, I said at least 125. I actually found some decent ones for about 100, 99. So maybe you could go down to 100. But again, you want to make sure to look for these features: good coating, center focus with good pivot mechanism and good eye relief. So some way of adjusting the distance of the eyepiece to your eye. If you have other, yeah.
Are there any binoculars that are able to block out the sunlight, or is that really hard to do? Like where you get the contrast on the blackbird, or where you have to change your position where you're at to see the color?
Not that I know of. That doesn't mean they don't exist.
I'm sure that's really expensive.
I'm sure there's like a polarized lens that helps get glare.
Yeah, well, the coatings on the lenses do that to some extent.
Or you don't want to change the color.
My suggestion is move. Yeah.
It doesn't cost anything.
You know, yeah. The scope? That's 40 years old. Clean them. Go. So if you're going to clean the lens, oh, it's in my sweatshirt. Use a lens cleaner, right? You don't use you don't use your shirt or something, or Kleenex. So I get my glasses at Walmart. And when you buy glasses at Walmart, they provide a lens cleaning cloth. I use this for my binoculars. And so that works really, and I just use it on this. So the advantage of this is it doesn't scratch the lens, and that's really important. Because if you scratch the lens, you're scratching the coating. And it's the coating that's really important.
Yeah, but you said something about like either nitrogen gas or argon gas.
I think it lasts forever, as far as I know. It's sealed, so it's not leaking out. That's why it works. Yeah.
How about, I've seen a lot of birders and bird watchers on the trail, they have this kind of a small ocular. Have you seen those?
The monocular?
Yeah, monocular?
Yeah,
But they're small.
right. So they're usually a little shorter than the binoculars, and they're easy to hold. So I can see why people would like them. I just like using both eyes. Although when I did my observations here, because I'm a trained biologist, and I started with microscopes with only one eyepiece, I can keep both eyes open. And the advantage of that is I could observe through one eye and take notes with the other eye. Right. So that's just a little, that's here, neither here nor there, as they say. Sort of. They both are awake as far as I can tell. Okay, so now that you've bought your binoculars, I have some recommendations. Use the strap. Don't just carry them, because if you just carry them, you're going to drop them. And if you drop them, there's a chance you're going to break them. So you don't want to do that. Before you look through them, remove the lens caps. I talk about that famous picture of George Bush with the lens caps in place. Set the eye relief, so that's the distance to your eyeball. Right, so the different binoculars have different methods of doing that. On my Leicas, you have to pull them out. So no glasses, glasses. Others you have to pull and twist, and they're more adjustable. So it's not just open or close, but it's anything in between. Adjust the pivot, so that's how close or far apart the eyepieces are. You have to set them to your own eyes. I made the mistake of lending these to, I was up looking at the monarchs near Goleta, right? And there was this person there who was looking at the monarchs, and she said, "Can I borrow your binoculars?" I said, "Oh, okay." And the first thing she did was go, whoop. So it took me a day to get them back to be right for me. Like car seats, yeah. Yeah. A driver sits in your car and moves the seat. Yeah. And then set the diopter, so that's the right and left eye. On mine, there's a center piece that does that, and it locks in place. So that's a really nice feature. The cheaper ones, that diopter, that eyepiece adjustment, it's free to move. So you have to keep resetting it. And every time you put it to your face, it moves a little bit. So you have to keep checking. Okay, and then finally, this is my last slide. This is the real question is, okay, I see a bird. How can I tell what it is? Well, it used to be called the $64,000 question. Now I think you'd have to call it the $64 million question. Right, so there are lots of things you can use, and if you were here watching the videos, if you saw all the videos, you probably didn't have time.
No, but I'll put them online.
Okay. The Cornell Lab of O, which is a great resource, they have 4 different videos talks about cues you could use to identify birds. So it talks about things like size and shape, habitat, color pattern, behavior. And birders use all of those, not necessarily even consciously. So they see something. I remember the first time I came here to do birding, there was a guy, a student at College of the Canyons, who was a really good birder. And so we go up to the ecology trail where we were, and he looks up in the sky, and there's some little dots. And he says, "White-throated swifts." He didn't even have his binoculars up. And I'm looking. I look, and I see little dots. But he could tell by the way it flew, where it was flying, the time of year, and a little bit about the appearance of it. He could tell what it was. Right, so he uses all those things. He wasn't using color, right, because you couldn't see color at that distance. But he used all these other cues as well. All right, so if you're looking at the bird itself, and you look at a field guide, the field guide will, one way or another, direct you to the key features of that species, things to look for. Now, it's complicated because, for example, plumage, it varies from individual to individual. So if you're looking at a red-tailed hawk, for example, one male red-tailed hawk can look completely different than another male red-tailed hawk. They're notorious for their variability. It also can differ male to female, so that's called plumage dimorphism, two forms, dimorphic. It can also vary by season. So they may look one way in the breeding season and a different way in the non-breeding season. And they can even differ by location. So they may look one way here and they may look quite different somewhere else. And they can differ by age. Very good. So I didn't mention before, the feathers have to be maintained, but of course they're dead material, so they also have to be replaced periodically. So birds have to molt, change their feathers, grow new ones. So unlike snakes or something, they just get rid of the skin and grow new skin. There's already a new skin there. They have to replace all those feathers. Some birds do that once a year. Some birds do that twice a year. Depends on the species. If they do it twice a year, the so-called breeding plumage can look totally different than the non-breeding plumage. Right? The ornithologists have all these fancy names for that. I won't bother you with that. So it can be really tricky. And if you think about it, because these birds are flying, and they need to be able to fly to make a living. They can't survive unless they can fly. They can't afford to lose all their feathers all at once and replace them all. So they do it in stages. So especially the flight feathers, right? They tend to lose those in pairs. So and there are different molt patterns. So some of them lose them from the outside in, some from the inside out. Yeah. So centrifugal, centripetal, that's what ornithologists call it. But if you've got a bird in a plumage, the field guides will direct you to certain key features to look for. And they have all these different terms for the different places. There are also different names for lines of color that go above the eye, through the eye, below the eye. All those have different names. It can get confusing. So I don't worry about the terminology, right? But you do want to be able to pick out what you need to look for and then remember them long enough to look in a field guide maybe, if you don't have a picture. Or as you're looking at it, consult a field guide or maybe an app and identify them that way. So I look for things like the shape and size of the head, the shape and length of the bill, whether there's color here and where is it. These parts of the wings are sometimes colored, so maybe right here and right here it could be white. Those are called wing bars. I look to see whether there are wing bars. If there are they really distinct or not? Things like that. How long is the tail? Is the tail notched or not? The finches tend to have notched tails, for example. And also, where is it found? So what kind of habitat? Within the habitat, is it high up in the tree? Is it in a bush lurking around? Is it on the ground? All those are typical for different species. So for example, here, if you hear something on the ground, it's probably not a ghost. It's probably a towhee, either a California towhee or a spotted towhee. Now they look quite different, but they're close relatives. And they like to scratch around in a leaf litter, so it sounds like somebody's walking there. Occasionally they'll fly up and you can see them, but mostly you never see them. So in addition to habitat, other behavior is really important, including what the bird says. What the bird says is, to me, more useful than what the bird looks like. So if I can hear it, I have a much better chance of being able to identify it, especially if I got Merlin running. If Merlin can hear it, Merlin can identify it. So we can try that out in the interpretive center in a little bit. Right? So not only songs, but calls. Calls are really complicated because there can be many, many, many of them. So one of the common birds here is the oak titmouse. It's a little gray bird with a crest, and it's only about this big. They're really common here. They're really hard to see. And not only do they have a sound, a song that's like Peter, 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 but they have hundreds of calls. So and Gary Park has done the same thing, he told me. He spent like an hour chasing down a bird that turned out to be an oak titmouse that he knows really well. He knows them like the back of his hand, and yet they could be making some sound he's never heard before, and he doesn't know what it is.
Are they mimicking
The northern mockingbird that we have, it hangs out right around the fields, the nature center here. That is a mimic. Also, California thrashers around here are mimics. So that's interesting. You might ask, well, why do they do that? And there have been studies. So one reason to do that is if you give a female a choice of a song that's got a lot of different elements, so complicated, versus not so many elements, not as complicated, the female prefers the more complicated one. And how do you add more things to your syllable repertoire? Well, one way is to imitate other sounds. And some birds are even known to imitate non-bird sounds. So there are birds that imitate phones ringing, all kinds of weird things.
There's birds in the forests that are being cleared, like in Central and South America, and the birds mimic the sounds of chainsaws and bulldozers.
Yeah. So you just use what you have. So, and then this is a game you can play, bird bingo. This is all having to do with various aspects of behavior. So as I said, what the bird is doing is just as informative as where it is, what does it look like, what does it sound like. Well, this is an interesting one. You may have experienced it. So mobbing typically is an anti-predator behavior. So maybe you've seen a crow or a raven or many crows or ravens harassing a hawk. That's very common. Right? That's a mobbing behavior. They're either defending a nest or getting ready to defend a nest. So I see it happening now. I don't think they're nesting yet, but they're going to be nesting soon. So they're just kind of revving up to do that. On my study area, I studied red-winged blackbirds. There are lots and lots of nests because it's many nests on one territory. And so as I walk through my study area, whatever male was defending that territory would come down and mob me. So as I left one territory and went to the next one, another one would pick me up, another one. All right, so they're just trying to get me to move on. They can't really hurt me. Yeah.
I have seen over by my house, which isn't too far from here, is a hawk will be holding a snake, and the blackbirds are just going nuts.
Right. So they're not reacting to the snake, they're reacting to the hawk. So redwings will also mob hawks. There's a picture on the internet of a redwing standing on the back of a hawk, like he's riding it. Yeah. They'll also mob things like tractors, cars, especially the mirrors, the side mirrors. Deer. They'll just mob anything. They can be, and the kingbirds are even more aggressive. Okay, so birds are kind of weird. They take baths a lot. I don't know of other animals that do that like that. So if you stand by in the hummingbird garden and watch that fountain in the summer, birds will come and they'll drink, but they'll also take a bath. So they'll stick their heads, dunk like that, and then ruffle up all their feathers and shake it off and do that over and over again. So they're bathing. That's maybe to stay cool, to keep the feathers clean. It may also help to remove ectoparasites, so little mites and things that actually eat their feathers. Yeah. We have that problem in the interpretive center because some of the birds we have on display there are stuffed real birds, and feather mites get on them and destroy them. So we're switching over to carvings now, wood carvings, yeah.
What about the ones that kind of like go into the dirt and then...
Yeah, dust bathing is another thing. And there's anting as well. So if there's a mound of ants, I used to see this on my study area in Wisconsin, they'll get down and roll around in the ants. The ants will crawl all over them, and I think they're taking off parasites. The ants are eating parasites. Yeah, so they have pretty nifty adaptations. So bark feeding is an interesting one. So there are some birds that can actually travel up and down the trunk. So here, white-breasted nuthatches, for example, they'll just walk right down a trunk. No problem. They can go up, but they seem to prefer to go down. I don't know why. They can go underneath a branch like this. Just walk along the underside of a branch. So they're looking for insects. They're gleaning, it's called. You can also look for styles of hunting. So right now, because there are a lot of insects flying around in the air. You'll see a bird perching and looking around, then all of a sudden it'll fly out and come right back. So that's fly catching. It's catching an insect on the wing and bringing it back to eat it. It's called sally forth. They sally forth, get something, and come back. Ground feeding, I mentioned that towhees do that. Around here, dark-eyed juncos do that as well. For example, if you've got a feeder that's hanging, the juncos are reluctant to go to that because they're ground feeders, or pigeons, mourning doves, things like that. But if the seed falls on the ground, they'll go there. According to Audubon, this is also National Bird Feeder Month. They want you to buy stuff from them. Soaring is a good one. So one question I get pretty frequently is, how do you tell the difference between a crow and a raven? Right? They're both black birds, although neither one of them is a blackbird. They're both birds that are black. They both fly. And often people say, well, ravens are bigger, but that doesn't help unless they're side by side. And you just don't see them like that very often. But in general, if you see a bird soaring, black bird soaring, holding its wings out straight and not flapping and just riding the air currents, that's a raven, common raven. The other thing you can look for is the wedge-shaped tail. That's very characteristic. Crows have a rounded tail, the end of the tail.
Different number of feathers in the ends of the wings.
If you can see that, but that's it's easier to look for soaring versus flapping.
Also the call.
Yeah, if you hear them calling, ravens have a much deeper voice,
They crow.
and they also make that weird popping noise. Yeah. Are they hanging out in a big flock, or are they pretty solitary? That's another cue. Dana talked about fission-fusion species. Birds do that too, especially in winter flocks. So in winter, birds that would normally be solitary on their territories, they gather in larger groups because it's more efficient to find food that way. And they can be more or less a member of one group or a different group. But sometimes groups can come together at a really rich food source and then separate again. So that's a fission-fusion model, social model.
Sometimes you see birds on the wire, all of a sudden you look up and there's like a whole bunch of, what is that?
Well, one thing, interesting thing about birds is that they have an individual distance. So they'll let somebody sit nearby if it's like this far apart. But if it's this far apart, that's intolerable. So starlings are famous for that. Right there. And so they look, when there's a bunch of them sitting on one line, they're like, somebody went out with a measuring tape and said, okay, you sit here, you sit here. So it could be something like that. Starlings are really interesting. Do you know about starlings? So they are called European starlings. That's the common name. Why? They're not from here. They're not from North America, but they're found everywhere in North America. They're also invading South America. They were brought to the United States by a group of people who wanted all the birds mentioned by Shakespeare. They wanted to see them in Central Park. So yeah, they brought them to Central Park and released them. Now they're everywhere. They are secondary cavity nesters, so they take over holes that woodpeckers have made. And so they're occupying holes that other birds would otherwise occupy, like bluebirds. All right, so they are somewhat of a pest problem. Europeans love them. So when Americans go over to Europe and they see a starling, and they say, oh, geez, starling. The Europeans will say, what are you talking about? That's a beautiful bird. We love them. Whatever. Oh, another thing I've noticed that I used to do all the time birding in Indiana and Wisconsin, New York, is that there are certain things the birder can do to bring birds to you. And one is, if you have cats, you probably know about pishing. That works to attract birds in Wisconsin. It does not seem to work here. It does not work in Europe. When I did that in Europe, all the Europeans started laughing. What are you doing? You're from North America, right?
Birds here like jazz music.
I sometimes use playback from my app, one of my apps. I use Sibley. That's frowned upon by some birders because you're stressing them out. But I don't do it very much, and it's not like they're not hearing other birds all the time. So, and I used to use playback as a research method all the time, again with permission. So remember I said, I don't know if I said song, bird song typically has one of two or both functions. One is to defend the territory, the other is to attract mates. Well, one way to test that idea for territory defense is to temporarily catch the bird and hold it. I just put it in a cage and put a cover over it so it's nice and calm. And I replace it with loudspeakers and broadcast redwing song. And when you do that, that keeps other male redwings from entering the territory. So that's really good evidence that in that case, the song is functioning to defend the territory. Because you don't even need a bird there. You just need the song. But I'm doing a playback for an hour under those conditions. Okay, so these are the kinds of things you can look for to identify a bird. And I think we're just about out. Yep, that's pretty good timing.